Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and, yep, you guessed it, Ukraine. So first off, I hope everyone is having a very pleasant 4th of July holiday. Please be safe out there if you're going to be launching some fireworks into the sky. And obviously, again, just be safe and, more importantly, have a great time. But today we are continuing our coverage, again, of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now, first, I got to get something off my chest here. And I just have to talk about this a little bit. I have been watching a certain individual, a content provider on YouTube, obviously incredibly pro-Ukrainian, probably taking a little bit of a little cheddar from open societies. A lot of them out there are doing that, especially some of the ones that are in excess of 200,000 subscribers. Definitely getting a little of that cheddar from open societies. Now, look, and especially today, especially on July 4th, Independence Day, as an American, if my country was attacked and there were another country's tanks rolling down the streets of the United States, if maybe the United States enters into an internal conflict with itself, am I going to pick a side? Absolutely. Am I going to flee the country? Absolutely not. Now, taking point, Ukraine. Obviously, we know what has happened. What has happened has happened. I've talked about this before. It is a much more complicated situation than this overt Russian invasion of a sovereign state. There was a lot more going on in the background before this turned into what it is now. A proxy war between NATO and the Russian Federation. And I'm not going to get into that because it's irrelevant. But if you then flee your country and go to Switzerland because you're terrified of getting conscripted and being sent to the front lines, but at the same time, you are making money off of this conflict. It is your job. But you fled. You left. You are a fighting age male who departed your country in a time of need. You go to Switzerland and you make content reporting on the war. And that's where it even gets worse, because obviously it's very heavily tilted towards the Ukrainian side. But what's even more disconcerting, at least for me as I see some of that content, it's wrong. It's incorrect information. If you go into a battle and you have 3 tanks and the enemy has 10 tanks and you lose all 3 tanks and you destroy 6 tanks of the enemy, let's just say 6 tanks, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. That means you have 0 tanks and the enemy has 4 tanks. That's not good. Anyway, that's really irrelevant. But again, just the nonsensical of it all, and the fact that you have the audacity to flee your country in a time of need, and you're going to tell me there's nothing that you can do? Nothing? At all? And you have these skill sets, these certain skill sets. Obviously, if you have those skill sets, you're intelligent enough to obtain those skill sets, you could be put to use helping your country. No, you flee, you run, and you go to Switzerland. Think about that for a second. So, we are going to continue our ongoing coverage of the conflict. There is not a lot to report in terms of territory being taken. The Ukrainians are continuing to have very much difficulty in the south towards Zaporizhia. That has essentially been written off. We are continuing to see possible operations by the Ukrainians near Oleshki. Now, we believe there may be, or there were, a Ukrainian company-sized element that crossed the Dnieper River and was operating on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. We know that Ukrainian unit was then attacked by Russian Iskander missiles. It then was there was a follow-on attack by Russian Special Operations Forces as well, Russian Light Infantry Forces from an unknown unit, possibly a GRU Spetsnaz, that conducted that operation just to the north of Oleshki, near the Dnieper River. Now that other content provider alleges that in the Iskander missile strike, there were no Ukrainian casualties. And in the follow-on GRU attack against those Ukrainian forces, there were no Ukrainian casualties. I'm sorry, I'm just being funny now. But you get the point. And oh, by the way, that is a Russian accent. It's not a Ukrainian accent. That individual does not speak Ukrainian. Most Ukrainians who identify themselves as Ukrainian don't speak Ukrainian. Did you know that? I was with a group of friends, and I mentioned that. I said, most people in Ukraine don't even speak Ukrainian. What? What are you talking about? That's crazy. What do they speak then? Well, they speak Russian. What? No, they speak Ukrainian. Ukrainian's Ukraine. Like, nope, you're wrong. Look it up. Actually, the fabled president Zelensky of Ukraine barely speaks Ukrainian. He speaks Russian. Most of them speak Russian. But again, you don't hear that. You don't hear that in the mainstream news. It's not talked about. So why does most Ukrainians speak Russian? Well, maybe look that up. Get a little more information. Don't suck in the open society's mainstream media bullshit, because that's what you're doing. And we're going a little out of bounds today because it is a holiday. Don't normally do this, but today a little bit different. So again, as we have talked about before, the Ukrainian offensive, namely just south of Orikhiv, and the other one that started west of Volhodar near Makarivka, again, has essentially stalled. Very little activity in that area. We're continuing to see Russian attacks against Ukrainian targets in this area, but the likelihood that we will see a Ukrainian breakthrough in the southern sector running from Zaporizhia to Makarivka, unlikely at this point. Highly unlikely. We continue to see very heavy fighting in the east. A lot of this is Russian counteroffensive operations that are taking place near Avdiivka. We also know that there is continued fighting near Bakhmut as well. So again, the territory essentially remains the same, with the Russians still controlling Bakhmut, north of Bakhmut, south of Bakhmut, and are reinforcing their positions in and around Bakhmut. Again, we are continuing to see the buildup of Russian forces just to the north of Seversk, and continued buildup near Soledar and Bakhmut as well. And we anticipate that there will be renewed Russian operations taking place in this area. Again, we're watching the lead up to the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. Again, I talked about this yesterday. This is something that could have been done elsewhere. And the problem, again, with this is while NATO is in Vilnius, they're going to be talking about further military operations against the Russian Federation. They are discussing plans, I would assume, that focus on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant at Indahar. Here, again, it appears to be, at least from the messaging, from what we're seeing from the mainstream narrative, is that the narrative is being shaped to allow for the introduction of NATO forces against Russian forces if there is some sort of action against that nuclear power plant. If radiation is released, if something happens, they're shaping the narrative to conduct operations and introduce NATO forces directly into the conflict. Now, has that decision been made yet? Obviously not. But you can see from the narrative that we're seeing in Western media talking about what's happening with this power plant, they're shaping that narrative. That is the in to introduce NATO forces into this conflict. I think at this point, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the generals within that organization, probably not the political leadership within the allied states, Germany, United States, fully understands that the Ukrainians are not going to make any headway without an air force. Now, providing that air force to the Ukrainians is going to be an incredible challenge. It's not going to be easy. And the easiest route for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to give the Ukrainians an air force is for their direct participation. Handing over F-16s to the Ukrainians, training their pilots, and having them take off from bases in western Ukraine is probably not going to work. It's going to be very difficult. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what will be the mission of these F-16s? Right now, these Su-24s that the Ukrainians are using, and we understand about 4 or 5 of them are in use and have been retrofitted to fire the Storm Shadow, to launch the Storm Shadow. But that's about all they're able to do, and some very limited attack helicopter operations, very, very limited air operations by the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainians they have to fly very low, and they can't go to elevation, go to altitude, because these Russian Su-35s just kind of float around just to the east of the front line, or well east of the front line. They have the ability to scan the Ukrainian airspace for these Ukrainian aircraft, and then they're able to launch these extreme BVR, beyond visual range, missile systems at those aircraft. So if the Ukrainians get the F-16, the F-16 is not a stealth aircraft. And they're going to have to go to altitude in order to engage Russian aircraft. And there's just not enough of them. And as they approach the Russian-Ukrainian border, if they go into the Kharkov region, if they go into Zaporizhia, if they go into Poltava, if they go into Kherson, again, F-16s, Ukrainian F-16s, hypothetically, if they get them, they're going to get shot down by these extremely long-range Russian BVRs. And then you also have the Russian air defense component, the S-400s that have been brought in as well. Makes for a very difficult situation, even if the Ukrainians get the F-16. So I think right now there's this push to try and get NATO involved in this conflict. Or by proxy, allow the Poles and maybe another country to get involved in this conflict without officially saying NATO's involved. But how do you do that? But then that gives the Russians every right to then strike Poland. And then there's the catch-22. Well, the Russians just attacked a NATO neighbor. Well, yeah, because the Poles were in the conflict. They've introduced forces into the war. So you can see how nonsensical this thing is getting, and you get to kind of see where we're heading. Ultimately, it's going to be this simple. There's either going to be negotiations, there's going to be a discussion, and there'll be an end to the conflict, or the conflict's just going to escalate, and there's going to be World War III. That's eventually what's going to happen. You got choice A or choice B. Talk, figure this out, or we keep going. And that's what's going to happen. And in all likelihood, right now, both sides have a lot of fight left in them. And until there is a dramatic change on the battlefield, in which one side realizes they have been defeated, then you may see an end to the conflict. But not until then. It's just how war is. So look, again, everyone have a happy 4th of July. Have fun. Stay safe. Thank you for joining us. Have a good day.